The night Paris lost liquidity. It happened without alarms, without crowds, without a single headline to mark the moment. Money was still there, banks were still open, and yet something essential vanished from the system. In Paris, liquidity did not collapse. It slipped away. To understand why this night mattered, we need to look past failure and toward function. Paris sits at the center of Europe's financial circulation, a place where capital is expected to move smoothly even when pressure builds elsewhere. For decades, that assumption held. Markets trusted that depth alone could absorb stress. That belief still shapes expectations today. The story begins not with panic, but with hesitation. Late in the trading day, dealers noticed trades taking longer to clear. Quotes widened slightly. Funding requests were met, but with questions that had not been asked before. Nothing broke, but nothing moved freely either. The system was still alive, yet its pulse had slowed. Inside major institutions, treasury desks tracked the shift in real time. Cash positions remained adequate, but availability became selective. Liquidity existed, yet it clustered defensively rather than circulating. Participants preferred holding flexibility over providing it. Each decision was rational. Together, they altered the market's behavior. What made the moment dangerous was its invisibility. Traditional indicators showed stability. Capital ratios held. Volatility stayed contained. There was no trigger for intervention because there was no visible crisis. But liquidity is not a stock. It is a behavior, and that behavior was changing. As night settled over Paris, interbank activity thinned further. Short-term funding rolled, but without ease. Confidence had not collapsed. It had paused. And in modern finance, a pause could be more revealing than a shock. Those watching closely understood what was forming. When liquidity withdraws quietly, it does not announce itself. It waits. It accumulates pressure beneath normality, and if left unexamined, it can turn routine stress into something far more severe. Paris had not lost money that night. It had lost motion, and the consequences of that loss were only beginning to unfold. As the hours passed, the withdrawal became more deliberate. Institutions did not refuse to lend. They recalibrated. Limits tightened. Haircuts increased. Maturities shortened. Liquidity was still available, but only on terms that signaled caution rather than confidence. The market had not frozen. It had become guarded. Inside Paris's largest banks, risk committees convened quietly. They reviewed exposures that looked acceptable in isolation, but uncomfortable in aggregate. Counterparties were sound, yet interconnected. Funding was accessible, yet conditional. The realization spread that liquidity depended not on balance sheets alone, but on shared willingness to engage. That willingness was thinning. Dealers adjusted behavior accordingly. Inventories shrank. Market making slowed. Quotes widened another fraction. These were technical moves, barely visible to outsiders, but their effect compounded. With fewer participants willing to intermediate, small imbalances lingered longer. Prices hesitated. The sense of flow that defines liquid markets began to erode. What troubled observers most was the absence of fear. Panic can be addressed. Calm withdrawal cannot. There were no rumors to deny, no headlines to counter, no single institution to reassure. The system was responding to uncertainty that had no clear source, only accumulation. Each participant was acting prudently, yet the collective outcome felt brittle. Regulators monitored the situation with increasing unease. Standard stress indicators remained quiet. No thresholds were breached. Intervention tools were designed for shocks, not slow retreats. The frameworks that protected against collapse offered little guidance when the problem was hesitation rather than failure. As midnight approached, funding desks reported that rollovers were clearing, but later and thinner than expected. The market was still functioning, but only just. Liquidity had become episodic rather than continuous. Access depended on timing and familiarity, not openness. The night exposed a vulnerability few had acknowledged openly. Liquidity is sustained by confidence that others will provide it when needed. When that belief weakens, even slightly, markets can hollow out from within. No alarm sounds. No rule is broken. Yet resilience quietly drains away. Paris was discovering that safety does not guarantee circulation. And without circulation, Even strong systems can begin to suffocate. The question now was not whether liquidity would return by morning, but what this silent retreat revealed about the system Europe believed it had secured. The turning point came not from markets, but from observation. By early morning, it was clear that liquidity had not disappeared overnight. It had redistributed. Funds clustered inside institutions, held back as precaution rather than deployed as confidence. The system had not failed. It had chosen restraint. Inside regulatory offices, analysts mapped flows hour by hour. They saw the same pattern repeating across desks and banks. Cash accumulated in buffers. Credit lines were preserved rather than extended. The incentives created by years of reform were guiding behavior exactly as designed. Safety mechanisms encouraged holding rather than sharing in moments of ambiguity. What made the situation delicate was timing. Acting publicly risked introducing fear where none existed. Doing nothing risked allowing hesitation to harden into habit. The system was balanced on a thin edge between caution and paralysis. Liquidity can be restored quickly if confidence returns. It can also vanish entirely if restraint becomes norm. Banks felt the pressure internally. Treasury teams debated whether to deploy excess liquidity or maintain defensive posture. Each institution waited for others to move first. No one wanted to be the outlier providing liquidity if others did not. Collective action failed not because of distrust, but because of symmetry. Markets reflected the same tension. Activity resumed slowly, but depth remained thin. Trades cleared, yet momentum lagged. Price discovery functioned, but without energy. The absence of stress masked the presence of friction. Regulators recognized a familiar pattern. After major reforms, systems become resilient but cautious. They survive shocks, but hesitate during uncertainty. This was the trade-off playing out in real time. The tools built to prevent collapse were now shaping behavior in quieter, less visible ways. The question confronting Europe was subtle but urgent. How do you restore motion without creating alarm? How do you encourage circulation without undermining safety? The answer would require more than reassurance. It would require coordination. As discussions began behind closed doors, one conclusion emerged. Liquidity was not a technical problem. It was a behavioral one. And behavior cannot be commanded. It must be guided. Paris had not suffered crisis. It had revealed a fault line. And what lay ahead would determine whether that fault line widened or healed. The response took shape with deliberate restraint. Regulators did not announce new programs or loosen rules publicly. Instead, they coordinated quietly, aligning expectations across institutions so no single bank felt exposed by moving first. Signals were sent privately. Timelines clarified. The message was subtle but clear. Holding liquidity was safe, but sharing it would not be punished. Central banks adjusted operations at the margins. Access windows were smoothed. Settlement flexibility increased without changing headline policy. These were not rescues. They were reassurances delivered through mechanics rather than words. The system was reminded how to move. Gradually, circulation returned. Dealers rebuilt inventories. Quotes tightened. Funding rolled with less hesitation. Nothing dramatic marked the shift, because drama had never been the problem. Confidence returned not through declarations, but through experience. Each successful transaction made the next one easier. Paris never announced that it had lost liquidity, and it never announced that it had regained it. The night passed into memory without leaving a visible scar. But inside Europe's financial architecture, the lesson endured. Liquidity is not guaranteed by strength alone. It depends on willingness, timing, and coordination. The episode reshaped how policymakers thought about quiet stress. Not every threat arrives as collapse. Some arrive as pause. And pauses, if misunderstood, can be just as dangerous. The challenge is knowing when to intervene invisibly and when to let the system breathe. Paris had not faced panic. It had faced hesitation. By addressing it without amplifying fear, Europe preserved both stability and trust. The fault line remained, but had been bridged, at least for now. The night Paris lost liquidity became a reminder written in silence. In modern finance, what matters most is not how systems survive shocks, but how they behave when nothing seems wrong. Subscribe to join the journey. The night